Welcome to the context video for the Faerie Queene. In this video, we're returning to a subject that we have addressed in partial form numerous times before this moment, which is the Protestant Reformation and the kinds of religious division that the Protestant Reformation wrought in England during the 16th century in particular. So I want to start this video by walking through some of the main complaints that Protestants make about the larger Christian church in the 16th century. They start by saying the church in general has become too decadent, filled with unnecessary, self-indulgent things that were not originally in the Bible. And these things are corrupt. They think that people in what becomes known as the Catholic Church, they think that they use too many religious images, that these images lead to idolatry, that people are focusing too much on the images instead of like the meaning behind the images. So they say destroy all religious images. And in fact, they launch a huge iconoclastic campaign throughout Europe, throughout England, and destroy a lot of very old, very valuable religious artwork because of this kind of iconoclastic drive. They also have complaints about a Catholic ritual known as the Eucharist, in which, the priest presents bread and wine and says, this is Jesus's body, this is Jesus's blood. In the 16th century and in the 15th century before it, Catholics believed that these things really became Jesus's body and blood, that they were truly transformed into those things. Protestants were having none of that, and they said that's patently false. It does not become Jesus's body and blood. And they say that's all hocus pocus. And that's not a modern paraphrase. That's in fact where this word hocus pocus comes from, because the Latin phrase that a priest would say, hoc est corpus meum, sounded to them like hocus pocus. That's all a bunch of mumbo jumbo that you've made up about the bread and wine. So they're against the Eucharist. They also say we need to strip the church of all this extra blasphemous baggage and return to the simple church described in the New Testament. So they value simplicity, as much simplicity as possible. What does that mean concretely? No images, no religious images, no stained glass windows, no smells and bells, as it's sometimes referred to, no incense, no noises, no ceremony, and beyond like the church structure, no elaborate church or papal structure. There's no pope. We don't need a pope. So what they really value is just a simple, plain room for worship, as simple as possible. And if you want to know a little bit about like the historical progression of the Protestant Reformation throughout Europe and England, here's a bit of a timeline. So Martin Luther is the person who kicks this off in 1517 when he posts his 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany, outlining the 95 complaints he has about how the church is operating. As this movement grows, it kind of spreads throughout Europe, and eventually, about 20 years later in England, Henry VIII will separate from the church. He doesn't do this purely for religious reasons. He wanted to divorce his wife, and the Pope wasn't letting him, so he was advised by some very shrewd Protestants who told him to separate from the church and start a Protestant church instead, and he'd be able to divorce his wife. So that's one of the many reasons he starts the Church of England and separates from the church. When Henry VIII dies, his son Edward becomes king, and Edward is a child who has been tutored by Protestant tutors, and he is very, very devoutly Protestant and begins to execute Catholics. He begins to martyr them, according to the Catholics. And then when he dies from illness, his older sister Mary becomes queen, and she was raised Catholic. So she restores Catholicism in England and executes Protestants. So by the time Elizabeth becomes queen, she's seen a lot of executions happening, and although she is herself very Protestant, she wants to kind of tamp down the religious violence, and she desires to embody a via media, or a middle way in which Protestants and Catholics can get along. So one of the effects of the Protestant Reformation, very concretely in England, is a lot of violence, a lot of warfare, and a lot of death. And we have documentary evidence from the period about how people were executed. This comes from John Fox's work the Acts and Monuments, which chronicled many Protestant deaths in the period. So a lot of people in the 16th century witnessed this kind of thing. And I bring all of this up because Edmund Spenser really leans into his Protestant identity. We could talk about some of the religious subtleties of other 16th century work we've been looking at, but for Edmund Spenser, it's not so subtle. It's right there at the forefront. So when he's writing the Faerie Queene, and as we know, the Faerie Queene explores 12 moral virtues, he does so from a Protestant perspective in particular. So his moral virtues are very closely tied to a Protestant point of view. Furthermore, the opposite of virtue, I guess vices, he's also illustrating, and those vices tend to take on Catholic forms throughout his work. So we see a lot of Protestant and Catholic images and themes and coded language throughout the entirety of the Faerie Queene, but you'll especially see that happening in Book 1 and Canto 1, which we're reading this week. So keep your eye out for those Protestant Catholic themes as you read.